Before I had an office, do you know where I did all my work? The Dunkin' Donuts on Torresdale and Levick, right here in Wissinoming. I would go sit there for hours with a computer. I gave off a real, homeless vibe back then, to the point where the employees, this is not a joke, started inviting me to their house because they were like, I don't think this guy has anywhere to go. I had somewhere to go, I just didn't have an office, so I worked in Dunkin' Donuts for hours. And you know what would happen? When I left Dunkin' Donuts, do you know what I smelled like? Burnt coffee and despair. I would just kind of leave and I would smell like Dunkin' Donuts, and I could smell myself going home, and I'd get in my car and my car would smell like Dunkin' Donuts, and I'd go home and the whole house eventually would smell like Dunkin' Donuts, because what was on me, I was bringing it with me, and it was affecting the atmosphere everywhere I went. Oh, you already got the sermon illustration there? Okay, good. So, do you remember last week? I'm just going to quickly review. This is a two-part sermon. If you didn't hear last week's sermon, I'm going to try to catch you up, but you might need to go back and listen to that. If you remember last week, I talked about the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. That's when the 70 families that populated the earth after the flood of Noah, they wanted to build a tower so that they could reach God, and maybe also so that they could survive another flood. Having a tower might be helpful in that situation. Well, God saw that as an act of rebellion. He decided to judge those 70 families, and he sent and was among, it seems, spirits to the earth for the purpose. This is judgment. This is not God's general plan. This is a judgment of sin to confuse the people. He confused their languages and he scattered them. Okay, that's Genesis chapter 11. We see that God says, come let us, plural, he's speaking to somebody, come let us go down and confuse them. They're scattered. And that's how really that's the biblical narrative of how the world is populated and people spread out. Now, it doesn't say this in Genesis 11, but it does say in Deuteronomy 32, Moses who wrote Genesis 11 also wrote Deuteronomy 32. Moses, when reflecting on the Tower of Babel, said this: when the people were scattered and received their land inheritance, he divvied up or apportioned the land based on the number of angels. That's what the ESV says, that's what the NRSV says, and even in my beloved New American Standard Bible, it's in the footnotes. But it says something slightly different in the passage, but it's in the footnotes. When God spread the people out at Babel, this is what Moses is saying in Deuteronomy 32, when God spread the people out at Babel, he divvied up the land of the earth based on the number of confusing spirits that went with them, okay? He goes on in Deuteronomy 32. The people provoked God to jealousy by offering sacrifices to demons. Okay, one of the first places in the Old Testament that makes a reference to a demon. So this is the general idea of the Tower of Babel. God is judging them. So this is a punishment by confusing them. When they spread out, with them is spreading out evil spirits, confusing spirits that scatter. So when the people scatter, the spirits scatter with them. When they get to whatever their new homeland is, wherever, they now have been accompanied by these, it says in Deuteronomy 32, demons they've been sacrificing to. Okay, does that make sense? If you were here last week, I spent 45 minutes explaining that. That was a little review. But just like when I walk into Dunkin' Donuts, whatever's on me is coming with me, and it's going to be in whatever place I land, right? Well, for them, it wasn't the smell of despair and burnt coffee. For them, it was these spirits that were scattered among them. And so that's kind of the biblical explanation of how we have all these people in all these places speaking all these languages with all these different religions. Does that make sense? Okay. Now that should not be the first time you've heard that, because I talked about that last week, but if you weren't here last week or have a short-term memory issue, that's what I talked about last week. You can find that sermon online. I want to pick up with that and really quickly just want to reference one passage in Daniel before I jump in the New Testament. Okay, I want to show you how that reality of spirits scattering with the people and being localized or regionalized or territorial. I want to show you how that develops through the Old Testament. And in Daniel chapter 10, Daniel has this incredible experience. He sees this vision, and I got to move fast, but he sees this vision, and the vision is so overwhelming, he basically passes out. It says that he fell asleep like a dead man, okay? So he basically passes out. He feels a hand on his shoulder. That's what wakes him up. When he wakes up, someone's speaking to him. We don't know exactly who it is that's speaking to him. We know from Daniel chapter 10, verse 2, that Daniel has been fasting for 3 weeks. How many days is 3 weeks? 21. Okay, I know some of you got to think about that. That's fine. 21. In Daniel chapter 12, Daniel chapter 10, verse 12 and 13, this figure who puts their hand on Daniel says this: "Do not be afraid, Daniel, for from the first day that you set your heart on understanding this and on humbling yourself before God, your words were heard. I've come in response to your words. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia was withstanding me for 21 days." So he's saying, this person is saying to Daniel, from the day you started, the beginning of the answer to your prayers has been in motion, but I was withstood by this prince of Persia the entire time, all 21 days. Okay? The prince of Persia was withstanding me for 21 days. Then behold, Michael, one of the chief princes, not Michael Sharkey, but a different Michael, one of the chief princes came to help me, for I had been left there with the king of Persia. And then if you'll go down to verse 20, this person says, this figure says to Daniel, "Do you understand why I came to you? But I shall now return to fight against the prince of Persia. So I am going forth, and behold, the prince of Greece is about to come. However, I will tell you what is inscribed in the writing of truth, yet there is no one who stands firmly with me against these forces except Michael, your prince." Okay. I'm not going to get into all of the book of Daniel. Here's what I want us to take away from that passage. There are these spiritual figures that are called the Prince of Persia, the Prince of Greece, and then Michael is Daniel's prince. We understand that Michael isn't an angel, okay? I'm telling you, the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece, Daniel did not understand those to be human rulers, but spiritual forces. In fact, they're called forces in verse 21. Whoever this figure is that's speaking to Daniel was trying to get to Daniel for 21 days, the length of his fast. The prince, or the evil spirit over Persia, which is modern day Iran, the evil spirit over Persia withstood him, delayed him for 21 days. Finally, Michael comes and helps him out so he can get to Daniel. He delivers his message to Daniel, and he says, now I'm going to go back. Not only do I have to go through this prince evil spirit of Persia, I have to go through the evil spirit of Greece too. You see how this is just the Tower of Babel story evolving. You know, these spirits spread out, and now cultures and nationalities, they're starting to put boundaries down, borders, names, languages, cultures are developing. And what Daniel is seeing here is, okay, there's an evil spirit in Persia. There's an evil spirit in Greece. What's interesting, and I wish I could get into this more today, but I won't have time, is who is the prince over Daniel's people? Michael, a good, obedient angel. When God scattered the people at Babel, Israel did not get an evil spirit. Actually, in Genesis 10, with the story of Abraham, that is Yahweh saying, essentially, while all the other families are now scattered and spirits have scattered with them, I will be your God, and you will be my people. You are my inheritance. I have picked you. I've chosen you. And anyone that wants to come back to me has to go through you, Israel. Does that make sense? That does not mean you have to go get an Israeli passport. That does not mean you have to go move to Israel. Here's what it means. The culmination of coming back to Yahweh through Israel is through Jesus. You come through Jesus. You don't have to move. You don't have to learn a new language. That's one of the battles they fought in the New Testament. Does that mean I have to get circumcised? Do I have to start eating kosher? Do I have to learn a new? Nope. Just faith in the Savior of Israel, Jesus. That's how all the nations return back to Yahweh. Does that make sense so far? Okay, now, here's what I want to get at today. What's up with these demons? What's going on here? They are, man. Yeah. So, here's what I want to look at today. I want to look at the New Testament understanding of the spiritual world. Okay, and this probably should take more than one day, but I'm trying to do this succinctly. We're going to read from Ephesians 6 as well as Colossians 2, and we're going to kind of go back and forth between those two passages. So if you can go to Ephesians 6, we're just going to read verses 10 and 12 right now. Ephesians 6, 10 and 12 say this, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God so that you'll be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places." Then if you can go to Colossians chapter 2, I'm going to read verses 13 and 15. These should be on the screen as well. "When you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all of our transgressions, having canceled out the certificate of debt consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us. He has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. When he disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him." So I want to try to answer three questions. The first is this: what are rulers, powers, and authorities? Okay, Daniel is an important passage because that's the first place that these spread out, scattered spirits are called princes. Well, in the New Testament, they're not called princes, but they're called principalities. You can see how that's, with a couple hundred years and a change of language, that's just their way of saying that these evil princes Paul calls principalities, powers, rulers, and authorities, okay? So this is the first question I want to answer. What are rulers, powers, and authorities? Well, Paul kind of describes them in Ephesians chapter 6 when he says, our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers and powers. And then he elaborates, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Is he talking about people or spirits? Spirits. He just said we're not fighting flesh and blood, right? So we're talking about spiritual realities. So these powers and rulers and authorities, he calls wicked powers of darkness and spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. Okay, so he's talking about these things as spirits, evil spirits, wicked spirits in the spiritual world or the spiritual realm, however you want to use that phrase. Okay, this is how scholars and historians have understood this. I want to show you two slides. So take a deep breath. If you have coffee, take a sip of coffee. This is going to take a minute. Big words. Okay. The first slide is from the Evangelical Dictionary of Theology, if you can throw that up. Perfect. This is a very reliable, safe source for us. The Apostle Paul appears to have taken this expression, the expression being powers and principalities. He took that from late Jewish apocalyptic thought, where it was applied to intermediate beings, lower than God and higher than man. Principalities and authorities or powers refer to cosmic intelligences, occasionally angelic, that's Michael, but usually demonic. Other similar spirit powers are dominions, thrones, and rulers of this age. So as you read through the New Testament, there's about 8 or 9 passages, 9 I believe, passages that talk about rulers or powers or authorities. Sometimes just to be clear, Romans 12, when it says obey your rulers, that's talking about human rulers. But in these other passages where it talks about in heavenly places, we're talking about spiritual situations. Does that make sense? You're going to have to put your thinking cap on when you're reading the New Testament and ask yourself, okay, is this passage talking about human elected official or appointed officials, or is this talking about spiritual spirits? Okay, so going on to the next quote. This is from Craig Keener, one of our favorites here. Jewish people believed that not only human powers, but also the angelic ones that worked behind them ruled the nations. See Daniel 10, which is what we just read. Sometimes these guardian angels of the Gentile nations were hostile to God's people. These spiritual rulers, not earthly ones, are the true enemies. The spiritual battle behind the earthly one was always the most important. This was fought especially by prayer, worship, and earthly activity for God. So, really quickly, if I can apply what he's saying to Daniel as an example. Daniel's in a battle, right? There's an angel in Persia and an angel in Greece fighting against Michael. And what does Daniel do? Fast. That's his spiritual weapon, fasting. It's not shouting, it's not violence, it's not protests, it's not legislation. Not that I'm against violence, I guess, but generally the other things are okay at times. But his weapon is fasting. Okay? So that's noted in the quote that I just read. Here's how I want to summarize powers, authorities, and rulers. This is just a simple one-sentence summary. Powers, rulers, and authorities are rebellious spiritual beings that mislead nations, negatively influence society, and deceive people. Okay? I want you to understand that misled nations aren't just misled because they have a different political philosophy than us. I'm saying that there are actual spirits actively trying to mislead entire nations. Our society isn't in turmoil just because we can't define basic words. Our society is in turmoil because there are spirits that want to confuse and scatter us just like they did at Babel. Confuse and divide, confuse and scatter. I'm telling you that your neighbors can't wrap their head around Jesus, not because they're dummies, but I tell you that there's an actual spiritual force that is giving everything he has to keep them blind. Okay? Your neighbors aren't dummies, by the way. Weren't we all dummies at some point? Some of us still are. We're all dummies, right? So, that's what rulers, authorities, and powers are, but here's the good news. Jesus has defeated them. Jesus defeated them at the cross. The cross looks so different with our natural eyes. The cross looks almost unrecognizable to what happens spiritually. I'll explain what I mean by that. In Colossians chapter 2, I read this earlier. When you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us our transgressions, having canceled out the certificate of death consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us. He's taken it out of the way, and what did he do? He nailed it to the cross. We're talking about the cross here, okay? Not Pentecost, not the flood, not, whatever. We're talking about the cross, okay? Think of the cross. When he had disarmed the rulers and authorities, he made a public display of them, having triumphed over them through him. So at the cross, what did Jesus do? He triumphed over these powers and rulers and authorities. He disarmed them. He publicly humiliated them. The Jewish annotated New Testament, which is not even produced by Christians, but comments on the New Testament, says this: to be disarmed is to be stripped naked. To be a public display is to be humiliated. That's what Jesus did to these spirits at the cross. The language here in this passage actually sounds like what Roman emperors would do when they would go into battle and defeat another emperor or king. They would strip that king naked, put them in a cage, and parade them home, so that when they came back into Rome, they were like, look at this guy I just beat. He's naked. Oh, so humiliating. And maybe they would do that before killing them. No weapons, naked, embarrassed, and ashamed. That's what Jesus did to these spirits at the cross. You understand that? This is the part that's going to push you practically. How did Jesus embarrass, humiliate, and disarm these spirits? By being embarrassed, disarmed, and humiliated. You know what I'm saying? Like, he didn't fight them. He humbled himself. And in becoming humiliated, he was humiliating them. In being stripped naked, he was exposing them. When he was parading his cross through the city, people didn't realize it at the time, but he was actually parading Satan through. This is how I'm going to beat him, with this cross. It looks on the outside like, man, Jesus looks pretty weak. That was actually his strongest moment. The way he embarrassed Satan was by letting himself be embarrassed. The way he disarmed Satan was by not defending himself. Now, this is almost the opposite of how we fight our battles. Right? I'm going to defend myself. I'm not going to you're not going to say that to me, call me outside my name, do all that. I'm going to give you something to think about. Right? Which is why we haven't beaten Satan effectively in our lives. So, does that make sense? The way Jesus defeated them looked very much like Jesus was being defeated himself. But we know now, having the benefit of the rest of the New Testament, no, Jesus actually won. When it looked like he was losing, he was winning. When it looked like he was exposing them. Just keep that in mind the next time you find yourself in a conflict, when you'd rather puff your chest out and you realize it's a spiritual conflict. Okay? Now, that's how Jesus defeated them. How do we defeat them? Now, keep in mind, he's already pulled the plug on them. You know, they're gasping for air at this point. But here we are. We still have a battle to fight, okay? This goes back to Ephesians 6. This is a passage I read earlier. If you want to go to Ephesians 6, I'm going to read the whole passage. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God, so that you'll be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in heavenly places. Therefore, take up the full armor of God, so that you'll be able to resist in the evil day. And having done everything to stand firm, therefore. Gird your loins with truth, having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and having shod your feet with the preparation of the gospel of peace. In addition to all, taking up the shield of faith, with which you will be able to extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. With all prayer and petition, pray at all times in the Spirit, and with this in view, be on the alert with all the perseverance and petition for all the saints. With all perseverance and petition for all the saints. So we're told to take up the full armor of God. Now, here's how we do this, okay? This is how we defeat Satan in our lives and in our families and in our cities and in our nations. First, verse 12, we have to understand the nature of the battle. This is not a political battle, a social battle, a personal battle, an emotional battle. It's a spiritual battle. You do not wage war against flesh and blood. That's not the battle. Your coworkers, your family members, your neighbors, they are not the enemy. They're the prize. You understand? We're not trying to defeat our neighbors. We're trying to win our neighbors, right? We're not trying to defeat our coworkers who believe differently than us. We're trying to win them. We want to defeat the spirits that deceive them and win them. Does that make sense? Yes. Just like you had to be won. Right? All of us dummies, right? The rest of us that didn't know about Jesus all the way when we were born. So, we have to understand first and foremost that this is a spiritual battle. It's not political, social, emotional, educational, or personal. It's spiritual. That doesn't mean that it doesn't express. The battle shows up in the political. The battle shows up in the social. The battle shows up in the educational. But it's primarily spiritual. All that other stuff is downstream. Got it? Now, we're told to put on the full armor of God. Now, I'm married to a children's ministry director, so most of my exposure to the full armor of God is like making costumes for kids to wear. It's very corny, childish. I know it's hard for you guys to believe I'm corny because I'm so cool, but I'm still just corny enough that when I do pray through Ephesians 6, I still do motions. I'm not kidding. I put on the belt of truth, discount double check. I take up the sword of the Spirit and I'll hold my Bible, which is the Word of God, the shield of faith, the helmet of salvation, the breastplate of righteousness, the shoes of the readiness of the gospel of peace. I'll touch my feet when I pray that, if I could reach my feet. I'll put on the breastplate of righteousness. I will touch the parts of my body that are related because I'm a little corny and because I'm a human being that responds to tactile experiences like communion and baptism and laying on of hands and touching the parts of your body that you're praying over, okay? Now, we could say a lot about the armor of God. For the sake of time, this is the main idea I want to convey. When I read about the full armor of God, this is what I see. Put on the belt of truth. Jesus said he was the truth. Put on the breastplate of righteousness. Paul said Jesus was our righteousness. Put on the shoes of the readiness of the gospel of peace. Jesus is the Prince of Peace. If you go through the armor of God, you will find all of it corresponds to Jesus, that means you're just putting on Jesus. The helmet of salvation, who's our Savior? Jesus, right? The sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. John said in the beginning was the Word, right? The shield of faith, who's the faithful one? We are justified by faith in Jesus. It's the faith of Jesus that saves us. I mean, we're actually just putting on Jesus. He's using military metaphors to help us understand we're in a battle. Does that make sense? So just put on Jesus. Now, if I can take what Paul said in Colossians about disarming the spirits and match that with what Paul says in Ephesians, here's the picture in my mind. We're showing up to a battle. We got on a helmet, breastplate, belt, shoes, sword, shield. What's our enemy wearing? Nothing. Jesus has clothed us and made the enemy naked. So, let me ask a practical question. How should we be doing then? Really good, right? Maybe even better than we are. Right? Because that's the reality that Paul's painting for us here, is that you're showing up to a battle, you have weapons and armor. I've already taken the weapons away from your enemy. I disarmed him. And he's got no armor. He's naked. And everyone's laughing at your enemy. So beat him, for goodness sakes. Stop losing to this guy all the time. Okay, I'm projecting a little bit. But you understand what I'm saying? Like, this should be over in a minute. The only power he has, sometimes we give him our sword, or we put our shield down. Any power evil spirits have in our lives is because we gave it to them. Jesus already took it away from them. Stop giving it back. Okay, you're getting this. Good, because 9 o'clock was rough. But that was my fault because I was trying to teach the whole Bible in 40 minutes. Okay, now, it does say in verse 13, take up the full armor of God so you'll be able to resist in the evil day. If you think back 3 weeks ago, I preached from James about resisting the devil. This is just practical application of how to resist the devil. You want more information? Here's your more information. You take on the full armor of God, recognize you're in a spiritual battle, and you resist the devil. This is spiritual warfare 101 basic. Do not proceed past this until you get this. Okay? Don't try to get all cute with your fancy charts and graphs. Understand, resist the devil. I'm in a spiritual battle, put on the full armor. Get that down before you get past this. Okay, is this making sense? Let me tie this back to the big picture of the Bible then. Jesus has defeated these spirits that were scattered. Okay, he's defeated them, but he hasn't cast them into eternal fire yet. They're still on earth. They're still deceiving people. But he's also said, but now you're equipped to go defeat them. If I was Jesus, I would probably have sent or commissioned my disciples. And the commission would have been great. It would have been like a great commission. And I would have said, go to, you hear Matthew 28 when I say that, right? Jesus said, now go to all the nations. Remember, they were scattered. Now go to them and make disciples and baptize them and teach obedience. All those nations that were scattered and have been worshiping confusing, scattering spirits, you go get them. Now, we have not gotten there yet. The church has not reached every nation, every people group, every tribe, every tongue. But John in the book of Revelation saw a vision that we will. Because in Revelation, John looks over heaven and he says, I saw people from every tongue, every tribe, every nation, all the ones that were scattered at Babel had representatives now. Now, here's what the history of the human race has been. Hey, Yahweh, we reject your leadership. I know you said not to eat from that one tree, but I'm going to follow this talking snake instead. I know you said not to worship money, but I'm going to worship money instead. The human race's history has been rejecting God's rule. And that has caused us to be scattered and divided. Here's what John saw in the book of Revelation. A representative from every nation saying, I reject my false gods to return to Yahweh. I used to worship Allah. I used to worship Buddha. I used to worship this or that, money, sex, power. I've rejected that, and now I'm returning to Yahweh. And every one of those people groups that was scattered at Babel is going to have a representative now who's going to worship Jesus in different languages, maintaining their own personal and racial identities, by the way. We're not all going to become one race, but we will be one family. If you're black now, you're going to be black in heaven. If you're Hispanic now, you're going to be Hispanic in heaven. If you're white now, you're going to be white in heaven. That's not going to change. But we're still going to be one family, right? Because we all came to God through Jesus, who is a descendant of Abraham, which takes us back to Genesis 12. Does this make sense? It's these spirits that scattered among us at Babel get defeated at the cross. We get to go back and reconcile these scattered nations to Jesus, to their Creator. Okay? Okay, couple application points. It is interesting to me how in the Bible, God seems to address people in groups sometimes. He also addresses individuals in some passages, but sometimes he addresses them in groups. In fact, the book of Amos starts with 6 or 7 prophetic words against all these different nations, not Israel, other nations. And he's like, oh, you did this, I'm going to judge you. And then all the Jewish people clap, yeah, get him, God. And then there's a second nation, you did this, I'm going to judge you. And the Jewish people are like, yeah, get him, Yahweh. After 6 or 7 nations, all the Jewish people are clapping, get him, get him, get him. God says, now for you, Israel. And that's like chilling to me. Sodom and Gomorrah, judged as a group, right? He said, if there's even 10 righteous people in Sodom, I won't judge it. Well, there wasn't. So Lot got out, and him and a couple of relatives were the only ones saved out of that. Jesus says to some of the cities of the New Testament, if I took the miracles I did in your city and did them in Sodom, Sodom would have repented, which is his way of saying, you're worse than Sodom. So I think it's like Chorazin and Bethsaida. He says these towns are going to be judged and they're going to be found worse than Sodom. And how is the New Testament addressed? It's to the church in Ephesus, to the church in Corinth, even in the book of Revelation. 7 letters at the beginning, each one is to the church in a specific place. It's regional, it's territorial. I say that because that is not generally how we think of the church. We group people together, maybe based on theology. Oh, the Pentecostal churches, the Reformed churches, the conservative churches, the liberal churches, the white church, the black church. And we've divided the church, but what I'm saying is Jesus doesn't see denominational lines, or at least he doesn't seem to care about them. I don't think Jesus has divided the church up by race or political affiliation. I think Jesus looks and sees the Church of Philadelphia, or the Church of America, or the Church of Cuba, or the Church of Uganda, or the Church of China. He still sees us in groups, but I want you to understand, like, it's not based on our preferences. It's not based on our ethnicities. It's based on our assignment. If we're the church in Philadelphia, what that tells me is church is identity. Okay, we're the bride of Jesus. That's who we are. Philadelphia is our assignment then. It's where he put us. Don't forget about Philadelphia and put all your energy into other places. You know, if we're not going to reach Philadelphia, who is? You know? So the Church of Philadelphia, our identity is the church, our assignment is Philadelphia. We are also, for the most part, a part of the American church. Okay, so we have an assignment here. Don't just think that because you're not a missionary, you get to like play it cool. If God didn't send you somewhere, he set you here. And you should be taking that assignment just as seriously as someone we would send to another country. And so if you're part of the Church of Philadelphia or the American church, understand, like, we have battles to fight. There is a war. It is a spiritual war, okay? We engage it with spiritual weapons like fasting in Daniel's case, or Paul said to the Ephesians, all prayer. He was like, hey, pray a lot. Also, have petitions for God, and also pray. I don't know, but we're like, does he want me to pray? Those are the types of spiritual weapons that we have. I know it's like, how do we fight this? That's it. That's how we fight it. We fight it through fasting, prayer, the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word. Those are the weapons. And worship, worship, which Paul says to Timothy to wage the good fight by the prophetic words that have been given to you, which that tells me prophecy can be a weapon, you know? So we are in a battle. Understand that we are not fighting people. The church has inflicted so much friendly fire on itself. You know what friendly fire is? It's like when you shoot someone that's on your team. You know? We do that because, I don't know, they disagree with us on something, and so there's friendly fire. And I heard someone say this once, I don't remember who it was, that the church is the only army that shoots its own wounded. You know, rather than like caring for them and being a medic, and you know, we get someone who's like weak and we're like, This has to be removed. Now, this week, I think you're going to talk about this in your discipleship groups a little bit. I will also say, wow, last week I had more questions than ever. Maybe this week will be similar. That's fine, because I like those questions. I like talking about this kind of stuff. But you're probably going to discuss this a little more.